Welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship. I'm Melinda Epler, founder and CEO of Empovia, formerly Change Catalyst. I'm also the author of How to Be an Ally and your host for this show. Allyship is empathy in action. We learn what people are uniquely experiencing, we show empathy for their experience, and we take action. Want to learn more? Visit empovia.co, empovia.co, to check out more of my work. Let's get started. Our guest today is Cari Guittard, who is the Chief Strategy Officer and Partner at ChangeX and purposewerx, and she's also Leadership Professor at Hult International Business School. And I'm excited for this conversation we're going to have today about political intelligence at work, how we effectively discuss politics at work, how anti-wokeness is changing DEI and other ESG programs. ESG is environmental, social, and corporate governance, and also how we can affect change in light of those changes happening. So welcome, Cari.
Thank you for having me, Melinda.
Yeah. So before we dive in, let's describe ourselves for anybody who is blind or low vision on YouTube. I'm a white woman with long red and blonde hair. I'm wearing glasses and a long sleeve black blouse. And in my background, I'm in a white room. In my background, I have on one side plants surrounding my book, How to Be an Ally, with a bright orange cover. And on the other is a tall, skinny bookshelf with a plant cascading down it and books from different guests who have joined us on the show.
And I'm Cari Guittard, and I am a white woman who has very long blonde hair, which probably needs a haircut. And I am in my home office, which we call the tree house, because I'm surrounded by redwoods and the beach, the ocean is just at the end of my street. So I'm surrounded by these redwood trees and my books, my happy place. And I am wearing a very exciting color, navy, today. So
awesome. And our interpreters today are Ruby and Genevieve from Interpreter Now. You can learn more about Interpreter Now at www.interpreter-now.com. Cari, would you start by telling us a bit about your story, where you grew up, how you ended up doing the work that you do today?
Sure. So I grew up in North Dallas, born and raised in Texas, and come from a family where my father was in the military and a fighter pilot. And so service was always a core value that I was raised in, as well as we traveled a lot as a family, and diversity was always a part of my upbringing. Even though I didn't live in a very diverse environment because I was in the suburbs of Texas, that was another value that my parents really instilled in us. And so the minute that I could, I went to undergrad and graduate school at the University of Texas at Dallas, which at the time was actually a research institute started by Texas Instruments. And I had the best time. I really, really enjoyed working with so many talented faculty who cared about their students and had relationships with their students. I mean, they wanted us to succeed. And so it was during that time that I was exposed to computer science and hacking, and it was really just a hobby. It wasn't actually something I ever thought I would have a job in. And I applied for a presidential management fellowship as I was finishing up my grad degree in Washington, and flew to Washington they have a big, job fair for everyone there. And the State Department at the time was ramping up their cybersecurity program. Dick Clark was heading the National Security Agency. It was the tail end of the Clinton administration. And so I took a job working in diplomatic security and cybersecurity. And that was a formative time in my career because I got to travel all over the world, as well as work within intelligence and law enforcement and technology. So it was a very unusual blend of a number of different forces. And it was a fascinating time. And then right before 9/11 happened, I had just come back from Egypt, actually, the night before. And everything changed for so many of us. And it was really a seminal moment for me because even though I didn't plan it, I ended up really getting sort of shifted into public diplomacy. Secretary Powell had come in, George Bush was president. It was a whole new slate of appointees. And it was one of those all hands on deck. Who knows anything about the Middle East, really, because it was something that caught everyone off guard. And we didn't have a lot of experts at that time. And so it was my first example of empathy in action, and really humility from leadership, because they were like, who knows anything about this? And I was 21 when I went to the department first. So I was a baby, right? And it wasn't about that. I mean, when you're in a moment of crisis, and we'll go deeper on this in our talk, but it's a fascinating window into power and real leadership. I mean, I think that's when the veneer gets pulled, right? And a lot of different forces are unmasked. And I was fortunate enough to be able to work with and witness some extraordinary leaders. And no matter what you think politically, working with Secretary Powell he's an extraordinary leader, right? And someone who really leads with integrity. And so I had briefed him on what we had gathered, the intelligence that we had gathered when we were last in the Middle East, right before the events of 9/11. And then he said, well, you're going to work for this woman, Charlotte Beers, who's from Madison Avenue. And I brought her in to help us win the hearts and minds of the Arab world. And I'll never forget that first meeting with Charlotte, because she was the first woman ever to be on the cover of Fortune and Forbes, 3-time global CEO of 3 of the largest top 10 advertising agencies, a force of nature, stunningly beautiful and couture clothing. I mean, when I watched the movie The Devil Wears Prada, it was like I was living in that, because I was the lowly, unstylish staffer. I was wearing all my black and pinstripe suits, And she spoke a different language. And this was my second experience with real empathy and allyship in action, because she called a branding meeting of all the chief marketing officers and CEOs of the largest, most iconic global brands to come together to go, how do we really leverage business to find a way to re-engage with the region? Because quickly we could see how we were pulling away. And that just did not make sense from a business perspective. It didn't make sense from a national security perspective. And people in branding and marketing, they're all about empathy and connection and trying to understand people. So if we're going to build influence and build understanding, we have to think of different ways to engage, right? And so talk about funny. I mean, these amazing people, creative leaders from all across the spectrum of business came together for 3 days at the State Department. They did not eat, these people, as I recall. They just drank a lot of caffeine. And once again, it was who's been in the region, who's been on the ground. And there were only a handful of us who had just recently been there. And it was just this sort of egos put aside. How do we come together and solve these challenges? And really, how do we think thoughtfully about this? So it wasn't about posturing and what the political messages were. It was, how do we find a way to solve this and work together? And that was the first time I ever saw the power of business coming together with government. And then we also brought in NGO leaders who were the most trusted in the region to go, okay, we all have different strengths. How can we leverage that complementarity to really do this right and do it in a thoughtful way? And so that was, for me, it was such an incredible foundation to work in and to be in. And Charlotte, as a leader, incredibly tough on me. And she would always say that she was tough on me to make me better. But I share this background because that really framed how I then, sort of charted my path from there on out. And both Charlotte and Secretary Powell resigned within a year of one another. They were both ready to leave because we were quickly going into Iraq, Afghanistan. It was a very different political environment. And I knew that it was time for me to leave before my idealism was completely crushed. And so as I've always done in my life, and my parents have always encouraged this, but anytime I'm uncertain about the next move, I become the student again. I go back to school. So I was applying to PhD programs. I was looking at, I'm going to be really methodical in how I make my next step. And it was really sort of a confluence of events once again. But one of the CEOs that had been at that branding event that we had at the State Department, Keith Reinhardt, he was hosting a day behind the scenes at DDB Worldwide. And he was the chairman of DDB, one of the largest global advertising networks. And a mutual friend said, well, before you leave the State Department, I want you to go to New York for a weekend. If anything, it'll be a fun weekend in New York, and you can just, hang out with some senior Hill staffers. It's a way of just learning more about advertising. And I said, look, I'm not going into advertising, but I'll go anyway. It's a free trip to New York. So I get there, and of course it's amazing because DDB is a very special place. I mean, as a global company, they just attract and retain some of the sharpest, coolest people ever, right? And we had a number of their CEOs come and present different elements of DDB's work. And of course, it was awesome and super stimulating. But then they asked us, well, do you mind? Our chairman, Keith, would like to come in. He's got this new project. He wants to share it with everyone, and it's called Brand America. Okay. Then it was over lunch, and Keith came in, and this is where my view of empathy and allyship and really leadership dramatically shifted, because Keith is known as a quiet visionary. He's never the one that's in the front of the room. One of the top 100 creative minds of the last century. I mean, just widely recognized, award-winning, all of this, but that's not what he leads with. And he comes in and he says, well, I'm working on this project. I'm getting ready to go to the University of Texas at Austin to give this talk. What do you think? And he proceeds to lay out this idea for how business and really even competitors within the advertising space, but also the client companies that they had, how they could come together to work separately from politics, separately from government, to engage with the world, a sort of a rethinking, if you will, of how companies engage and sort of foreign policy and just all of that. And he called it Brand America. And it was so inspiring. And I broke out in hives. I mean, I was like, that is the best idea I've ever heard. And the Hill staffers are looking at me like I'm crazy, because when I get passionate about something, my students know this about me too. I turn red and, but it just made so much sense. And it was really the first time when you think about public-private partnerships, we talk about it all the time today, but this was a way of business taking the lead and business going, look, we have serious security concerns for our companies around the world. Anti-American sentiment was the highest it had ever been. So that groundswell of support that we had, post 9/11 had completely eroded. So there were security concerns, there were business concerns, and it was like, okay, how do we come together to try and find a way forward, not just for these companies, but for the United States, and do it separate from the political environment, which was increasingly toxic. So I learned, again, navigating even political leadership, both within companies and their competitive interests, as well as within governments from a very different vantage point. And so he invited me up to his office and he said, you seemed very excited about this idea. And I said, yeah, I think it's an amazing idea. You got to do it. And I said, and I'd work for you for free if you want me to do this. I want to help you with this. And he said, okay, well, why don't you go home tonight and write a proposal for it instead of going to this really fancy dinner in New York or whatever. And I wrote him a 5-page letter, which I'm embarrassed to admit today because I don't write any 5-page memos about anything. Everything is super short. Even my students, I'm like, you have to condense it down, right? But I still have that letter. And it was the first time I experienced real flow. People talk about flow, where the energy just comes, your passion, your strengths, all of it is aligning, your values. And I just put it all out there. And he said, okay, I want you to come work for me. I'll give you 3 months. And you can work out of the DDB offices in San Francisco. Because at the same time all this was happening, I was set up on a blind date with a 5th-generation chocolate maker here in San Francisco. And I'm allergic to chocolate. So I was not seduced by the chocolate one bit, but he was pretty cute. And we've been married for 20 years. But so I was like, my life was changing. Everything was changing, right? And so Keith hired me. He took a big risk on me. He hired me for 3 months and said, I want you to build a global board. I want you to see what you can do with this. And we ended up having it for almost 10 years. And worked with companies all over the world, really unusual partnerships. And it was the first time I had ever worked in what we now call social impact, and what I also call corporate diplomacy, because it allowed companies to exert influence, political influence, not only, and thought leadership, not only within their industry, but also within governments. Because as companies know now and deeply appreciate now, back then they did not, you have to get ahead of the regulatory cycle. You have to be able to engage and build social capital deep within governments. Otherwise, it's going to come back and bite you in the ass. And so it was a fascinating time to kind of work with companies in this very new nascent space, because a lot of companies had, their government offices in DC that they never touched or paid attention to unless a crisis hit. And we weathered a lot of crises with these companies. And it was just so, so fun and extraordinary. And then our last effort, we actually launched with the Obama administration on entrepreneurship. which once again, and it was a partnership with EO, the Entrepreneurs Organization. And that was really focused on, okay, how do we really seed the best parts of business around the world and share our best practices from an innovation and entrepreneurship standpoint? So, finding ways for business to lead that wasn't politically toxic, it was just extraordinary. So when we retired the effort, because we thought companies are doing this on their own, I started my own consultancy to kind of continue that work, which I did for a period of time. All of which leads me to where I'm at now. And John McNeil was one of the original CEOs of that founding effort with Keith. And he was CEO of TBWA Chiat Day back then. And he reached out during the pandemic and he said, look, Cari, I'm starting this new effort called ChangeX. And we're all about scaling social impact for the brands that we work with. And John's one of those people that's just so much fun to work with. He always asks me at the end of every call, like, are you having fun? Because he's like, the minute you're not having fun, right? It's like,
that's a good one.
John had told me, if he told me he was selling hair care products, I would have found a way to sell those hair care products. He's just, and he's such a brilliant branding and strategic mind. And he had joined the Next Practice group and launched ChangeX out of that. And so that's really where ChangeX was born and how we could really empower and equip not just brands who are trying to elevate and expand their social impact, but also purpose-driven founders. And so purposewerx came out of that, where it was a collection of purpose-driven founders who were like, look, we really want to drive and embed meaning in everything that we do for our clients and do it in a very thoughtful way that's measurable, that's actionable. And, being a purpose-driven leader can be a very lonely space.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's kind of the arc of how I ended up here, which is a very unusual, nonlinear way of, but purpose and social impact have kind of been a common thread all the way through, and strategy, big picture, like how can we really leverage the resources and skill sets of, partners that are all around us that I think too often we have blinders on too. So
Awesome. And I think a lot of what you're saying can also be translated into the work that we do internally in companies too, is how do we influence those changes and how do we collaborate on those changes? And we want to talk specifically about political intelligence within the workplace and how we discuss politics at work. So maybe we could talk, can you just define political intelligence? What does that mean? Yeah.
So political intelligence at work really is about how we navigate and neutralize the informal and formal power structures within any organization. And organizations are living entities, right? They're organic. And I think increasingly the nature of work has made it harder to see those invisible forces of power and who has resources and what they do with those. And then to be able to not only navigate that, but navigate it in a way that best positions you to step into power. And so political intelligence is really and I say our because I've been plotting and conspiring on this for some time with a colleague of mine, Dr. Ali Fenwick, who's an organizational psychologist based out of Dubai. He also teaches at Hult and is just a thought leader on a number of levels within this space. But we built this course together because we recognize that there is a skill set within political intelligence that everyone needs within business. And yet we don't talk about it in business ever. It's such a taboo. And yet we know that we need to have these skill sets to ascend to leadership and to ascend to power. And women in particular, I mean, I hear this common, sort of excuse. I'm sure you've heard this many times, but I get it, right? Women will say, well, I'm just not going to continue at this company or want to pursue those leadership positions because I'm just tired of the bullshit. And I get it. But Allie and I were like, look, we need more principled, purposeful leaders in leadership, period. We don't have enough of them. So we have to help reframe the bullshit and go, okay, this is a reality of work. This is a reality of any human system, right? We're social creatures. How can we break this down in a way that anybody can strengthen their political intelligence and reframe that deep aversion that we all have for politics, the external politics that we see on the news every day, to a place of curiosity? Because once you get into it, it's really about understanding behavior, but then also deeply looking within ourselves and our own ability to be aware of what triggers us, how we manage our emotions, our situational awareness, and how we adapt in those moments. And so our goal with the graduate course that we developed and just literally taught this past weekend in San Francisco was how many tools and how many practical skill sets can we literally give to people so they can then continue to practice this going forward. And the other strange thing about me is that when I was in grad school, I had the opportunity to work for Senator Phil Gramm, who in Texas was a senior senator at the time, one of the few to switch from Democrat to Republican. And there again was another example of formal political leadership where I remember one summer he sent me to every Democrat rally in the state. And he said, I just want you to go and listen. I want you to just listen to people and then let me know what you hear back. And it was a watershed moment for me because, first of all, I recognized you could see how powerful the media was and how people thought the senator could do certain things or not. But really listening to people and just trying to understand where they were coming from, it was such an exercise for me. And again, better understanding how we can connect with people and help solve problems. And the fact that he wouldn't make up his mind. He was like, look, I want to do what's best for my constituents, Republican, Democrat, independent, And I share this because we don't have enough leaders like that today. Colin Powell was the same way. He would take issues on face value and try and make the best decision with the information at hand. And it takes courage to step into those moments, and be willing to weigh and take all of those points of view. And so I think there's just so many aspects to political intelligence, right? Where there's a lot of blind spots and barriers that we have that we broke down in the course, that we have to be really honest with ourselves. Because anytime we have a deep aversion to something, and we've called it the Political Intelligence Detox Project. We got to figure out a better name, but we just ask people to share with us. Just share with us your stories in this space. And the stories we've already heard, I feel like we've opened Pandora's box, but that aversion comes from a real place, and it's rooted in fear. And that fear is different for each of us, how that manifests. And so we even went deep on that level too, because we have to be able to do that work to then go, okay, that's no longer a blind spot for me. And now how do I actively then work on the external? So it's both internal and external skill sets.
Yeah. And it sounds like there's emotional intelligence and building empathy and compassion for one another, listening, all of those things as well. And so let's apply it to discussing politics at work. And we're in a time, and we have been for some time, it's continuously evolving, where a lot of corporations are saying, no, we're not discussing politics at work. And then obviously that impacts people in lots of different ways, especially as you define politics, right? As we increasingly out in the world are seeing anti-critical race theory in education, we're seeing anti-trans, anti-drag, anti-LGBTQIA plus legislation. Suddenly those pieces of identity become politics, and you can't talk about those at work as well, which is very problematic in my mind. And so maybe we could talk first about what is the importance of doing that, of talking about politics? What's the purpose of doing that?
Well, I think one of the ways that we approach this too is we wanted people to be curious about motivations behind certain decisions or statements that are made, or really being curious at a deeper level, right? About what we observe just across the board. And I do a fair amount of geopolitical risk work. And so within that work, I'm constantly having to absorb a lot of different points of view. And it's essential that you absorb every point of view, not just one. And I think too often, because we're all exhausted, we don't have enough time or energy, we don't do that extra step of being a journalist in many ways about the information that we take in. So one of them is really actively taking a look at our informational capital and what we're putting in, like what we're reviewing, just at a very basic level, and to see multiple points of view. So part of this is really, at Hult, what I love is that we in any given cohort, we'll have 60 or 70 nationalities who have very different views about the world around us, and even different ethical perspectives and moral perspectives and all of that. And there's nothing I enjoy more than engaging in conversations of politics and cross-cultural concerns and religion. I get into all of it because I want people to be curious and to develop their own points of view, and also to be willing to think again. Because when someone is willing to engage with us and disagree with us, that means they respect us enough to engage. So even how we engage with others, that's a bit of a reframing, right? And I was just with a client recently, a head of HR, and she said, well, we're in HR. We don't talk about religion and politics. And I said, but that's ignoring the fact that people are curious. These are aspects of our life that we don't just detach when we go into the office. And by the way, these external forces also affect the business. So don't we want people curious, gathering points of view? And there's a way to do it. And this is why you need people who, like Allie and I we facilitate contentious discussions all the time. So that's our happy place. But you really need a skillful facilitator. I wouldn't just throw somebody into that environment and be like, because it gets really, people can get triggered, and you have to be able to actively manage it so it stays productive. So I teach a graduate elective in gender intelligence. And it's funny because the reason I was even asked to teach this course and develop this course to begin with, which I first taught on the Dubai campus that Hult has, is because I'm a woman. Not because I was doing anything in the gender space or because I was in women's leadership. And I actually said that. I was like, I don't know anything about this space. They're like, well, but you're a woman, so you know. And that was 10 years ago. And so once I started getting into this, I said, okay, I'll do this, but I have two conditions. One, men and everybody in between have to be invited into this room. And two, we have to focus on very practical ways that we can assess blind spots that we have and biases, and find practical ways of more effectively engaging at work every day going forward. And this is what I appreciate so much about Hult, because, they said, yes, that's, let's do it. And I'll never forget that first class, because we had, I think, 75 women and 5 men who were very quiet the first 2 days. But by day 3, they just came alive. It was just, they had a moment. And the last time I taught it, we had more men in the room, as well as many individuals who identify as non-binary. And that for me was like, wow. But even within San Francisco, when you're dealing with a global audience, we've all been raised and socialized with different gender norm expectations, with different understandings of what the roles are or what's expected of us. There's a lot of myths and misperceptions. And so I bring in a lot of guest lectures, different perspectives. And I'm constantly navigating that conversation so that people can leave, not that it's with my point of view or with one of my guest lecturers' point of views, but they have more knowledge now to pull from to develop their own point of view. And more than anything, they come away from any masterclass they have, with me for sure, curious. And that's all I want, is I want people to go from having locked in entrenched points of view, which gets us nowhere, to I'm willing to be open to this. I'm willing to be curious and to engage different points of view, right? So we can extrapolate that across a number of different veins. Politics, same thing. It's not about the personalities when I bring together groups and I'm facilitating, or even if I'm there, and we're talking about a strategy session with a board, inevitably politics will bubble up. And instead of shutting it down, like that HR professional was telling me, she's like, well, we shut it down. We just don't talk about it. I was like, well, that's interesting. How might this affect our business? And let's unpack that further. And so it really takes a willingness to go deeper into what's the root issue that you're actually talking about. Are we just wanting to talk about, these personalities, or do we really want to talk about policy? Because if we want to talk about policy, we're going to find a way to find common ground. And so that's where, from at least the way I like to facilitate, and Ollie's the same way, I like to bring in design thinking in everything that I do. It's like, how can I bring more humanity into that moment? And, Adam Grant's book, Think Again, is one of my favorite of all the books that I've read recently, because it really pushes us to consider we need to think again about a lot of these different things, right? And go, well, why do I think that way? and what informational inputs could be biasing and skewing that, especially when you look at the dearth of disinformation, right? So I even have like an information hygiene sort of checklist that I share with my grad students in any session that I facilitate, because on the geopolitical risk side, I'm absorbing a ton of content every day anyway, because I'm just nerdy that way. But I give them my cheat sheet of, these are the 3 things that I track and follow every single day, and then weekly. And then, so I'm very methodical about it. But the 3 T's are, 1 is traction. You have to pay attention to traction because that's what's hitting that day. But you can't let traction consume you. And I think too often that's what we do. Like this submarine. We have Russia we have a serious geopolitical situation happening. And yet I have members of my family that all they want to talk about is the submarine, and yes, that's a horrible, horrific thing. But it's like, there are other things that could potentially affect the global supply chain, the global order, nuclear weapons, because if you look at how the media, even the business of the media, right, which very well, is designed to draw us into those human interest stories, fine. Right. But to be able to detach and go, okay, that's a moment of traction. I'm aware of it, but I don't need to expend any more energy going down that, not a rabbit hole, but down the submarine hole. So the one beyond that is really trends. And so it's looking at the sources that we're pulling so we can identify signals of change, and really pulling together some of the deeper reporting. And this is where I've collected journalists all over the world over the years that I appreciate for their journalistic integrity. We were lucky enough, we had Pauline Chu come and guest lecture at our course this weekend. And she's a media icon, foreign correspondent for CNN for many, many years. And she talks about how you always triple source your information. The great journalists, they not only triple source their information, but their analysis is so much richer and thoughtful. And we just don't read anymore. If it's not in a little snack bite, we just don't even bother. So I kind of try and find a way to gently ease people back into, okay, how can we expand our thinking and evolve our thinking so that it is more thoughtful and intentional about whatever we're curious and passionate about? Because there's no way we can cover the whole world and all the issues happening. And that really requires then us to be focused on what we ultimately want to achieve. So that's what was fun with the students. So from a political intelligence perspective, you can't get sucked into day-to-day political wins or even 1 year to 5 year political wins. Political intelligence is looking a minimum of 10 years out. And where do you ideally want to lead and be? And that requires a different level of even imaginal intelligence, which we had fun with because I was taking them into some visualization exercises and really going, how do we develop clarity? I call it our X. So in ChangeX, we talk about that X. It's what ultimately gives you deep meaning. And it's where you bring in your strengths, your values, and your purpose all together. And you're able to define your X. So we do it for companies, but we rarely are invited to do it for ourselves. And so that, I think, for the students, I noticed this weekend, because we had about half alumni, which was super fun. I love when we have alumni because they're out in the world working and bringing a different level of just experience and wisdom into the room. But, not only are we never taught this, right? But the other thing is, the further we go along in life, especially 10 years out, which is what most of the alumni that have engaged with this have been, we have so many other constraints on our time and energy. And often our future horizons are defined by the roles that we have today. And so one of the first things I always ask my students, but I did it with this course in particular, is I said, I just invite you to take the mask off. And some of them had to really yank it off because it's like on there, right? It's like, that's what, put it to the side. And with that, put every role that you currently have in life, parent, partner, whatever it is, right? And go, okay, if it were just for me and I'm able to imagine my future 10 years from now, ascending to my ideal leadership position, what might that look like? What would it be? And so to see people just like their shoulders, their body language, it's like a weight has been taken off, just taking off the mask, because we're never invited to even take off the mask on the daily. Yeah. But then to revisit, no, I mean, if I could really impact something, And it takes a while to do this work, by the way, because I suck at it. The first few times I did these exercises, I did it at the Institute for the Future, and then I've subsequently done it in other iterations because I also teach with the Unbeatable Mind Academy that Mark Devine, the Navy SEAL, that he launched, and he does a number of these practices. And I was so frustrated because I was terrible at it. And Mark was like, Cari, this is not about perfection. This is about being willing to revisit the practice over and over and over again, and quieting the mind, and all these things that I wish I had known and practiced long ago. The practices I'm teaching my kids to do now, they're practices that I really went deep on and refined during the pandemic, because I was, just really trying to collect a number of tools that would support resiliency. Right. And how we rebound is because I had so many students all over the world. I had 250 at that time that were isolated in different parts of the world. And there was just so much fear and uncertainty. And so that's a piece of political intelligence, because it's like, what are you using this for? And when you start doing some of these practices of visualization, and you're able to crystallize that X, that then builds the neural pathways and the plasticity to support those decisions that are going to get you to that point. And that's a very different way of looking at political intelligence than, say, the way it's always been framed in the media about poll numbers and election cycles, or even leadership cycles within companies. And then some of the skill sets too, we explored, like when there's moments of transition or crisis, that's when we dial up our political intelligence, our situational awareness, and go, I'm going to start paying attention more. I'm going to tune in more and engage at a deeper level. Because as we started this session with, it's like, those are the moments in my career where I've been able to clearly see the force field. I've been able to go, oh, wow, okay, this is the person in power. And oftentimes I've been surprised by who that person was. Sometimes, I kind of could have assumed that would have been the person, but oftentimes they come out of left field, because they just happen to be the one that's willing to step into that moment and lead. So it's, how do we navigate that force field, which is, I think for just a lot of people, it's super intimidating, because especially as you're remote working, it's hard to just even connect with people in a genuine way over Zoom. So I understand that anxiety, but I will say, I knew we were onto something when we first did it for alumni. Ollie did it in Dubai. I did it in I did it in New York. And then we had the course this weekend, because at the end of it, they wanted to keep learning. And that's when I was like, okay.
Yeah. And, I'm thinking about how this applies to, the importance of talking in our workplaces about politics, and kind of really deeply opening ourselves up, taking off the mask, opening ourselves up. I think letting go of what's happening in this one crucial moment to look at a bigger picture of how can I create impact over time allows you the space to really see, well, who are all the players? What is that power? What is that power dynamic? What are the power dynamics? And who has the power? How can I start to create influence? But you have to create that psychologically safe space to do that as well. And so I'm thinking also about the number of, recently the Supreme Court ruled against Harvard and UNC for their affirmative action admissions. And some say that corporate DEI programs will follow. We've seen already in the past big changes happening when Trump first became president. He rolled back programs. He issued an executive order. And now we're seeing it in the Supreme Court as well. So, and at the same time, we're also seeing a rise in the amplification of voices that are opposed to these programs, DEI programs, ESG programs. And as a result of contraction of those programs, add to that the economic situation that's currently happening. We have a severe contraction to these programs right now. And so people can become a little bit defeated, deflated right now, right? What would you say to folks who are feeling a little deflated and defeated? And maybe it is to kind of take that wider picture, but of, the 10-year picture, but what would you say?
Whenever I see forces like this compounding, and I'm certainly seeing it as well in the conversations that I'm having with senior executives. I mean, for sure, they're saying that, the toxicity around this sort of woke, anti-woke, and DE&I and even ESG to a certain extent, the thought leadership behind it, when you have strong thought leadership and you start to see wins and traction, you're going to have that sort of, pendulum swing back the other way, right? Same with LGBTQIA plus initiatives, trans rights. When you have a more coordinated, effective thought leadership movement happening, you're going to see that coming the other way at it. And so this anti-woke sort of approach, well, first of all, it's a deliberate political tactic for the next presidential cycle. So that's partly why we're hearing more of it, and we're just going to hear more of it going forward. But the thing that concerns me is how well funded it is and how well organized it is. So this is not just, sort of a one-off. This is a very serious coordinated approach to reduce ESG and DE&I. And so here is a perfect example of why I feel so moved to develop these political intelligence tools, because most of the people that I work with within ESG and DE&I, they are purpose-driven leaders. They care. They volunteer with NGOs. It's always been somewhere a part of their story and their narrative and their experience. And they think that that should be enough, that the work should speak for itself, and it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to be equipped to be able to navigate this toxicity that's coming at this full force. So for a company perspective, I understand why companies are wanting to just lay low on a number of fronts, right? And yet, whenever I see forces like this, I immediately think, well, where's the opportunity? How can we shift that lens and reframe it for opportunity? And so because DE&I and ESG have become the targets, and because to a certain extent they've been commoditized, and also there's been a lot of DE&I and ESG, purpose washing and things that companies would say they were doing it, but not really doing it. Okay. So then there needs to be a correction, even within companies, and a recognition from senior leadership. No, these are our values, and this is where we want to drive impact. And we're not going to call it DE&I, we're not going to call it ESG, but we're going to continue to live our values. And I think that's important for a number of reasons, but it's going to require some brave corporate leadership to be willing to step into that. But I think they're going to learn very quickly that if they don't do that, they're not going to be able to recruit and retain the best talent, certainly not from Gen Z, and certainly not from Gen Alpha. I mean, the Gen Alpha is the most, idealistic, principled, want to be engaged in social impact, want to solve these problems. And this is the first teenagers are coming out of Gen Alpha right now. So we saw much of this in Gen Z, and you're going to see even more of that, especially as Gen Alpha comes into their agency. They're making money, they're spending money as consumers, and then they're looking at employment, right? So for companies, this is something a long-term, yes, it's a short-term concern, but long-term, really, it's an inviting back of what are our core values and what are we actually willing to step up and, stand in for. And so that's where I see an opportunity for companies to lead and problem solve like they never have before, but not try and boil the ocean, right? Because no company can do that. That just wouldn't make sense. And I think that's where a lot of leaders got in trouble, because there was just so much excitement and momentum that there were huge overcommitments. And we saw this during George Floyd, because there was a recognition that something needed to be done. And okay, we can marshal the resources. So a number of companies set up funds, but even, several years on, many of those funds have not been put into actionable programs that have shifted behavior one iota, and they're like, well, we just kind of didn't know what to do from there. So it's, I think it's an opportunity to look inward for companies and to go, okay, how do we really rethink all of this? And what is our kind of defining North Star and purpose strategy for the company internally first, before they do anything external? And the reason why that's also important, not only from talent recruitment and development, right, but also for their longer term strategy and competitiveness, and resilience, because this is the other thing too. We know we're going to have more moments of crisis where they're going to be called on the mat for their values, and they're either going to be able to defend those values or they're going to shrink away. And we have countless examples just in the last 6 months of companies who have not backed up their values. And it's affected their, their revenue substantially, as well as diminished their brand.
And their resilience in times of crisis.
So friends of mine who are working for some of these companies, they're like, what the hell is going on? And then on top of it, if you are in a situation where you're dealing with layoffs and things like that, it's like, okay, this is a moment in time. This is a contraction, but then we're going to be back in a moment of, growth again, and it's all cyclical. So where can you insert humanity? Where can you really sort of, once again, rethink, how are we bringing people in? And then how are we letting people exit in a way that they still have a positive sort of relationship with us, instead of just these sweeping kind of layoffs and, no real valuing of the individual human. And so that's the thing with, especially in the context of AI, it's sort of a reminder that we have to hold on to what that core humanity that we have with everything that we got, right? And not let technology completely subsume that, because that is the last thing that separates us: our emotions, our ability to feel, our ability to sense, and the complex problem solving that humans are able to bring into the equation. So it's like, how do you find that balance between the two? And so there's just so many different elements that are colliding, but I'm an optimist by nature. And so I just am always kind of looking at, well, where's that opportunity? Even in moments of extreme crisis, where's that opportunity for us to solve problems, come together, in a thoughtful way, and then, find a way as business leaders to, empower not only our employees, but also the communities that we serve in our customer base. And so, those leaders still exist. We just don't hear about a lot of them because a lot of these issues are only managed internally. And I've had so many senior managers now share, well, I probably spend about 25 to 30% of my time helping my employees and teams navigate toxic political issues that emerge. Like, I just don't have time for this. But this is where political intelligence is so important. It's because it's also a productivity issue. Because the minute someone is, Pauline Chu actually shared Megan Carl's book. Megan, I don't know if you've read it, but when she Walk Away to Win. She was
a guest on our show. Yes.
Oh, I love that.
So we'll link to that episode in the show notes.
I can't wait.
Yeah.
So the book is fascinating. I mean, I read it in 2 days, and, she was at Nike for 30 years. And look, a lot of the examples that she draws out, and that I think when we invite people to think back in their careers and stuff, not all of them are obvious. It's kind of like when Me Too happened. I've been very lucky in that I've had extraordinary male bosses and mentors. And I love men. I genuinely just adore men. And when I think back of moments of misogyny or being discounted or thought less of it, they were very subtle. And those subtleties have a cumulative effect on us over time. And they affect each of us differently, right? But basically, it's shutting people down. And Megan draws out a number of insights where it's like, and this is why Pauline brought it forward in her talk about psychological safety, because she's like, this is what bullies do. And so how do we reframe that, right? And one of the things too is just to be able to talk about it and share that. And so I think within companies, we need to, and we've been talking about it forever, having psychological safety. Companies know this. They have training programs on it, but they don't actually set up the environment for that. And so that's why I do a number of like one-off masterclasses where I can facilitate it and go, okay, let's have the conversation. Let's air those grievances. Let's air the big questions that you've always wanted to have, right? And just invite people to share their stories, but also to actually be heard. And to go, because you feel like you're losing your mind. Well, and you just are like, am I making too much of this? And we tend to retreat inward. We don't share it because we don't want to be that person who's like drawing attention or being the victim. And so it's like, how do we find a way to surface some of these? And also sending in an anonymous tip to HR is not going to get you anywhere either. That just goes into a void, or, because HR is there to represent the company. So you don't always feel like HR is your ally. So it's, it's really looking too at our relationship management. And one of the things we explored in the course is we were like, look, you have to have an army of allies and advocates around you that you build, that are trusted relationships that have your back. and
Yeah.
not expect the company to do that for you. It's not going to happen.
And I think about, what you said about finding the opportunity to, and you also said kind of in passing that the DEI and ESG terms, I think that one of the key things that I'm coming away with is be careful what we hold on to, and really see the bigger picture. What is that X? Is your X the term diversity, equity, and inclusion, the term ESG, or can you find a different approach that doesn't use those terms, that doesn't trigger that anti-wokeness movement? When I was an executive in a very non-inclusive environment, they were not ready to talk about diversity, equity, inclusion at all. And so I looked at what else can we do? How else can we create change? We created a wellness program, a physical and mental wellness program. We created an emotional intelligence program for leaders to develop empathy and understanding and have that psychologically safe space to have inclusive conversations, right? But we never said diversity, equity, and inclusion. There's lots of different tools that you've talked about here that get to that bigger picture of creating the change we want to see, looking at 10 years down the road and really thinking about, well, how can I get there if this path is closed or this path is not, am I going to keep fighting to go through that path, or is there one slightly different that's going to get us to the same place?
Yeah. And I love that you did that, because that also required you bringing forward your creative skill sets. And so so we had 2 guest lecturers, and the other one was Blaise Bertrand, who's a dear friend, and he's a creative leader who was a senior partner at IDEO and then went on to lead innovation at Google and Meta, and he's an entrepreneur and all of this. And he created his own word. He called it creatalytics, like politics and creativity. And at first my students were like, well, why? What does this make sense, right? That you would bring creativity together with politics. And then as he unpacked it, and really, he had never thought about it before in the same way until I sort of approached it, because I had this sense that was one of the missing pieces for this broader discussion, right? Yeah. And so that's what we were exploring. And in his session, he was talking about, people are always trying to figure out, how do I create engines of innovation within my organization, within my teams, right? And to really do that, you have to foster creativity. And yet creatives, and what I appreciate is Blaise, like, we're all creatives. In fact, he made everybody, one of the exercises we had to do was we had to draw a neighbor. And I'm watching this. And at first it was just like the most awkward thing ever, right? And then people started having fun with it. But and Blaise drew out, he was like, we started hearing you apologize. Did a lot of you apologize for what you put together? And they were like, yes. And yeah. And he goes, at what point did that become a moment of shame? Because when you ask kids to do this, they do it all the time. And there's no expectation of perfection but at some point we were told, you're not a creative. And within business, the creatives are sequestered. It's certainly that way. It's been that way for a long time in advertising. You don't let the creatives in with the clients. And I think the creatives are all the cool people. I'm like, why wouldn't you bring them in with the clients? But it's because they don't think linearly. And that's the beauty of their thinking. And so Blaise sort of invited everybody to reconsider that we are all creative. We just have to be able to tap back into that, right? So it's once you start doing that, your productivity goes up, but also you start making connections, just like you were talking about. It's like ways of identifying opportunity and value beyond whatever your job is narrowly defined as. And so for me, one of the things that I love to do is strategic alliances across sectors. That was never in a job title I ever had. I just was like, we need to be doing this. So I just took it upon myself I'm like, we're just going to start doing this. And I was super creative about it, because I noticed that the more unusual these partnerships were, the better you could be inoculated against some of the blunt attacks like the anti-wokeness or, and companies could kind of shield themselves. It would make them more resilient. It's the same with us as individuals. And so from a company perspective, it's like, how can you equip everybody who works within your organization to unlock their imaginal intelligence? Because if you did that, the amount of intelligence and value that I would be flowing into the organization from across the generational aspects to the different cultural perspectives, you name it, but all different layers of the organization, that would exponentially raise the value that's being contributed every day, right? Because it's fun to be creative.
Yeah.
And if you do it in a way, right, that it's guided and not just like we're all going to sit in a room and paint. That's not what I'm talking about. But it's like, that is something that I find just fascinating, that a lot of companies just don't get that. And of course, IDEO was built on this, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love it. Cari, thank you. Thank you for this impassioned conversation and giving us a lot of things to think about in terms of what we can do, how we can create spaces for conversation. One quick last question is, where can people learn more about you and your work?
So I invite everyone to just connect on LinkedIn, and that's probably the best place to find me. And I have one email that everything kind of goes to that email on LinkedIn. But yeah, I look forward to having people reach out. And I just want to thank you for having me. It's a true honor to be with you, because you're a pioneer on so many levels. Your book is amazing.
Thank you.
And, look, it takes a lot of courage to lead with empathy and allyship. So the fact that you've created this space, this podcast for people to share their point of views in a very authentic way, I just think is super powerful and inspiring. So thank you, Melinda, for just what you do. And everybody on your team is super cool and amazing. And I don't just say that because one of them was one of my top students. They really are just amazing, wonderful professionals to work with. So it's an honor.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, Cari. Okay, everyone, find your X, remove your mask, find that opportunity and really tap into your creativity, and then take action, whatever that is, step by step. And if you like this episode, we discussed Megan Carl's at the episode 125, how to address workplace bullying. And I also encourage you to check out episode 84 with Nisha Anand on the radical act of choosing common ground to create change. Also another good one. And it's right in line with this discussion as well. Thank you, everybody. Take action and keep moving forward one step at a time. Thank you for being part of our community. You'll find the show notes and a transcript of this episode at ally.cc. There you can also sign up for our weekly newsletter with additional tips. The show is produced by Impovia, a trusted learning and development partner offering training, coaching, and a new e-learning platform with on-demand courses focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can learn more at impovia.co. That's EMPOVIA.co. Allyship is empathy in action, right? So what action will you take today?